All right, guys. So what I'm going to be doing today is going through an additional lecture for you to understand how the America empires that were currently in the were currently in Central and South America were conquered by the Europeans. You have a worksheet that you're going to be working through while you're going through this PowerPoint to make sure you understand all of this information. This information is incredibly important. It sets really the foundation for some behaviors that we see from Europeans to natives for the next 150, 200 years in history, and it's really set up through these slides. Here we go. So the first thing that we need to understand is kind of where our own basic understanding of how a lot of people think the conquest went compared to how the actual conquest went. And this meme kind of gives you an understanding, which is that basically a lot of people think that the Spanish army was just so much more powerful than the native army, and therefore they were just easily able to defeat both the Aztecs and the Incan empires. And that's not true. In fact, we'll see, especially with really both, that the number of soldiers, the military force that both had, were incredibly strong. Now, the Spaniards did have some advantages. They had horses, they had weapons like guns that the natives did not have. However, there was a lot of additional factors that went into play, which that bottom picture is going to show you. And this is some of the stuff that we're going to be talking about. So let's just first start with the basics. There's three basic people that you need to know about. The first guy is Christopher Columbus. We talked about him in class. We're not going to really be talking about him in these notes. Then you have this group of people called conquistadors. These are Spaniards mainly who are going and they are conquering land. And the two Spaniards that you're going to need to know about are Hernan Cortez and Francisco Pizarro. Cortez is going to be the one who conquered the Aztec Empire. Pizarro conquered the Inca Empire. Now, just for geographical purposes, it is good to know where these empires are. The Aztec Empire was in modern-day Mexico. In fact, the capital city of the Aztec Empire is modern-day Mexico City, which we'll talk about kind of why that's a little important today. There's some stuff going on in Mexico City that may not be that good. And then you have the Maya Empire. We're not going to talk too much about the Mayas. And then you have the Inca Empire. That's all down South America, going all the way from really Ecuador down to Chile. We're going to mainly be focusing on kind of the Ecuador, and then the heart of the Inca Empire during this time period was in modern day Peru. So let's start first with Cortez. So Cortez gets a lot of play in history, and there's a good reason for why. This guy was a force of nature, both in terms of making sure he got his way and some of just the crazy stuff that happened along that way. So Cortez is set up originally in Cuba, and the Cuban leader at the time is going to assign Cortez to go and conquer modern day Mexico. Now, they had tried earlier, there had been two earlier attempts, and they both failed. Cortez had very little military experience, and he actually had huge beef with the Cuban leader, and to the point where the Cuban leader is actually going to re, uh, re uh, like take back this assignment from Cortez right as Cortez is about to go, saying, actually, no, Cortez, I don't really want you to go. Cortez, and this is kind of the first example of him just doing whatever he wants, is just going to say, don't care. And he's just going to go anyway. Just so you know, that's not allowed. He probably could have gone to jail for this, and this is going to come up later on. Now, modern day Mexico at this point was controlled by the Aztec Empire, as we already talked about. And along his way, he's going to find two very important people who could translate for him. One was somebody who had been shipwrecked in Mexico for 8 years, and he learned the language that the Aztecs could speak. And so because of that, that man is going to help translate. And then another was a woman native who is also going to know some Spanish, and therefore they're going to be able to communicate with one another. One really important thing about the Aztecs is that the Aztecs were not an incredibly peaceful people. There is some debate in history of how violent they were, but we're going to start at very violent. they believed in a sun god, and that sun god required sacrifices. If you look at this picture on the bottom right, that is a picture of a person getting their heart ripped out of their chest. This was a part of the sacrifice that a lot of times they would do, and a lot of these human sacrifices to the sun god would be local native tribes that the Aztecs had conquered. So the Aztec Empire was really big, but not everyone was Aztec. There were other native groups around there that the Aztecs had conquered. And these natives did not like the Aztecs, and Cortez is going to use that to his advantage. All right, so the Aztec leader at the time was named Matsuyama. And Matsuyama is going to believe in a lot of spiritual things. He believed that basically all of these different gods were going to send him signs and that he really needed to wait on a sign before he could really make an action. This made him a pretty weak leader. It made him pretty hesitant, and in this case made him believe things that were not true, which is that Cortez either was a god or a messenger from a god. There's some debate about that, but they believe that he had some type of God or messenger of God feel about him. And so because of that, the Aztec leader Matsuyama did not just immediately kill Cortez. Now, it should be noted that the Aztecs were an incredibly powerful military. They had at least 100,000 soldiers. To kind of put that into context, Cortez had had 600 soldiers when he left Cuba, but he had left 200 in another place in Mexico. So at this point, he only has 400 soldiers. So we're talking about 100,000 soldiers versus 400 soldiers. Now, this leader, Matsuyama, is eventually going to be killed actually by his own people. How the main narrative goes is that the local people were very upset that the Spaniards were here. They were like, hey, like, let's just kill these guys, get them out of here. And Matsuyama's walking around being like, I think that this is God. And they're like, he's not God. The God that Matsuyama thought he was potentially a feather god, a god that had feathers on it. Cortez can confirm did not have feathers. Maybe there were some people in the Aztec Empire that was like, I don't see any feathers. Let's kill this white guy. But for whatever reason, Matsuyama is going to go out and try to calm his people down, and his people threw stones at him, and apparently a stone struck his head, and that eventually killed him. But Cortez is eventually going to be able to capture the capital city of the Aztec Empire, which was an island. You can see a picture of it down here. It is believed to be one of the biggest cities, not just in North and South America at this time, but in the world at this time. It was incredibly beautiful. Tons of gold was all around the city, and it was surrounded by a lake. And kind of why this is important is because after Cortez captures the city, what he simply did was he cut off the water supply. And then he used cannons to kind of fire in, and this is eventually going to lead to them surrendering. But what that's eventually going to be is modern day Mexico City. Mexico City, if you're not aware, is one of the largest cities in the world. It's significantly bigger than New York City. Why that's important is because Mexico City is still actually underneath this lake. This lake is actually, Mexico City sits on top of it. And because of that, Mexico City is sinking, which, if you're not aware, cities aren't supposed to do. And what we're going to do about that is kind of unclear. Now, Cortez had some crazy stuff go his way. And so one of those crazy things was, as I told you, Cortez had a major problem with the leader of Cuba at this time, whose name was Velasquez. That was his last name. And Velasquez had ordered Cortez to come home, and Cortez didn't listen. And so what Velasquez did is he actually sent a separate army to capture Cortez. Cortez is going to end up defeating that army that came after him, or at least the leader of that army. And then he's going to be able to convince all the people that were coming to originally capture him that, hey, these Aztecs, they have a ton of gold. Why don't you come with me and let's go get some gold? And so because of that, that army that was actually originally intended to come and capture Cortez is actually going to partner up with him. This is going to be an incredibly good luck like action for Cortez, because He desperately needed more troops and more firepower and had no idea how to get it. A little other crazy sad story. Cortez, so that his men would not retreat while he was gone one time, just burned all the ships. So he had no way to actually get back to Cuba to get more weapons. And then all of a sudden, all these weapons and men show up. And that's just one way that Cortez got pretty lucky here. Now, maybe even a crazier story is that Cortez was married to a relative of Velasquez. And when she arrived to America, this is after Cortez had conquered all the Aztec Empire, she's going to die very quickly and very mysteriously. Now, there was a lot of shady stuff that was going on here. Number one, Cortez was sleeping around with a bunch of different women, and he had created children with those women. So he knew his parts were working, but he had tried to make a child with his wife for many years and was not successful. And additionally, Cortez had all of a sudden become this really, really big name in the Spanish Empire, and his wife was kind of a nobody. She wasn't really that important. Because of those two things, her not being able to potentially produce an heir and her not being really successful, and the way that she died, a lot of people think maybe Cortez killed her because, like, additionally, he didn't really like the family that she was in. So, yeah, that's crazy. So let's now turn our attention to the Inca Empire. So the Incas are going to be conquered by this guy named Francisco Pizarro, and he's going to arrive at a time that was incredibly fortunate for the Spaniards and very bad for the Incas. So there was this massive civil war going on during this time between two brothers. The brothers, their father had died, left them both kings. Two kings don't usually work. Dad should have thought about that maybe a little bit more. Those two guys' names were Huascar and Altahu Altahualpa. Altahualpa. That's a name. And Altahualpa had 100,000 people fighting with him. Huascar had 60,000 people fighting with him. 160,000 people total were involved in the Civil War. To kind of gain an understanding, Pizarro brought 130 men. And this is just a very, very good form of evidence to kind of show that the Incas were conquered because of very unfortunate circumstances. So Atahualpa wins, but Huascar had still a large number of supporters. And this is important because these supporters of Huascar are going to see Pizarro and the Spanish as kind of maybe being these savers that are going to save them from this leader that they didn't really like. So they're going to capture Altahualpa, the Spanish are, and they're going to make him pay a ransom to set himself free. And he pays a ransom. They literally said, we want one room filled with gold, two rooms filled with silver. And that equaled out to about $400 million. And this guy pays it very quickly. Now, this was a bad decision by this guy because what this ultimately shows is that the Incas have so much money that basically the Spanish are never going to leave. And Atahualpa is actually going to end up being killed by the Spanish, even though he pays this ransom. Now, while all this is happening, Pizarro's right-hand man is going to be a guy named Diego del Almargo. And Diego is going to arrive to help Francisco Pizarro. But Pizarro is going to establish a puppet leader named Manco. And they established this puppet leader because they thought that if the Incas saw another Inca in charge, that they wouldn't rebel against them. So Manco goes along with this at first because he had supported uh, Huascar, and he saw the Spanish as good. He was one of those guys who thought the Spanish kind of were going to help the Incas get rid of these bad leaders. Now, Diego and Pizarro start to have issues because of this one city called Cusco. If anyone's familiar with Emperor's New Groove, a 2003 pretty good, I think underrated Disney movie. Cusco is kind of the center city, and Cusco was the richest city in Peru during this time. Now, Pizarro was establishing Lima and Quito. Quito was in Ecuador, but everyone wanted Cusco. And Pizarro is going to get it. This makes Diego really mad. And what they ultimately agree to is they say, hey, let me keep Cusco and you can go conquer anything further south, which was Chile. And so Diego heads to Chile and to find more wealth, but it's not there. In fact, he has to cross over the Andes Mountains, which are incredibly tall. They're taller than the Rocky Mountains. A lot of his men die. And then they find natives there who are very, very talented at fighting. They push back Diego and all of his men. And they find out that there's no resources in the land anyway. The land's pretty barren. And so they start to head back. Now, Manco, who again is his puppet leader, who is an Inca, realizes that his power is completely fake and he's being constantly abused by the Spanish, like in really terrible ways. Like his house continually gets robbed and no one does anything about it. Eventually, another Spanish leader, who is actually the brother of Pizarro, is going to steal his wife, like literally just say, I'm going to marry your wife. And kind of a funny, like, little side story, Manco is actually going to find a woman who looks like his wife and give her to this guy. And apparently that worked for a while, but then the guy figured out that it wasn't actually Manco's wife, and so he ends up taking Manco's wife. Sad stuff. So Manco is going to eventually launch a rebellion with 100,000 men, which again is 100 times what really the Spanish have in Peru. But the Spanish have guns, and at this point they have fortification, meaning they have some cities that have high walls. And Manco gets close to winning, but as he gets close to winning, all of a sudden Diego returns back and he is able to defeat Manco. Now, Manco, even though he's defeated, is not killed at this point because Diego and Pizarro start to fight each other. They start to fight each other because he's like, hey, I went down to Chile. Chile sucks. I want Cusco. Pizarro's like, no. And they end up fighting for Cusco, and Diego wins Cusco. Now, Pizarro is going to eventually recapture Cusco and in the process kill Diego. But the son of Diego is then going to kill Pizarro. So now Diego's dead and Pizarro's dead. A civil war breaks out amongst the Spanish, and Pizarro's side is going to win. Now, Manco eventually is going to be killed by the Spanish, and the Spanish that killed him were actually Spanish soldiers that he gave amnesty to. So he allowed for them to come and stay in the village that he was living in because he wanted them to teach them how to use guns and how to ride horses. But these guys are eventually going to betray Manco and kill him, thinking that if they do this, they will be able to get a pardon for whatever they had done to be exiled to begin with. However, Manco's men eventually kill them. So just a lot of death. Diego's dead, Pizarro's dead, and now Manco is dead. So final thing, this is our biggest thing, is so why were the Spanish actually able to conquer the Inca and Aztec empires? So I kind of list these out in order of importance a little bit. Number one, weapons. Weapons are super important. We shouldn't understate it. The Spaniards had guns. These guns are going to not only be effective in killing the natives, but they terrified the natives. For example, when Pizarro captured an Inca leader, he used guns to kill somewhere around 50 people, they think. That caused 6,000 Inca warriors to flee. When again, Pizarro only had 130 men. So a couple of dropped. They've never seen bullets before. This is going to be very intimidating to them. The second, this can't be understated enough, it's smallpox. Smallpox was just destroying, especially the Inca Empire at this time, killing so many people, causing for there to be low morale, and then also just people not being able to fight. The third is honestly just luck, the timing. If Pizarro had arrived 10 years earlier, there's no way he would have conquered the Inca Empire. The Inca Empire would have been united under one king. The civil war caused for the military to be very weak and there to be a lot of political instability. For the Aztecs, like, so much had to go right for the Aztecs to be conquered. They first needed to find random translators, which caused for the Aztecs to trust the Spaniards. They needed to have weak leadership who believed in a sign from God for everything. And so therefore, when Cortez shows up, he thinks of him as a deity and he doesn't just kill him. And then additionally, Cortez is going to get that additional military to help. Next is political instability, meaning that the politics weren't very solid. The government wasn't really solid. Civil war for the Incas, and then Matsuyama was a bad leader. Both had local tribes that didn't like them. We didn't talk about this as much for the Incas, but the Incas had a huge empire, and that huge empire didn't all love the Incas. And so when the Spaniards arrived, they're like, yes, a good alternative, when in fact it didn't work out for them. Finally, both sides kind of initially trusted the Spaniards, which was a mistake. The Incas didn't see Pizarro as a threat, and even when they did, they thought that he was really just wanting money, which is why they tried to pay him to leave with $400 million, and that just was the completely wrong message to send. It actually showed, wow, you're willing to give me $400 million. How much money do you have? And then again, the Aztecs thought that Cortez was a deity of some type. And then finally, the natives fought against each other. There was not this pan-nativism of, hey, we're all Aztecs or we're all Incas and these Spaniards are the people that we should be kicking out. There was huge division amongst the natives, and because of that, they were able to easily fight against one another. All right. So those are the notes, and hopefully you were able to understand anything. We will talk about this in class in the near future.